Jake Morrison pushed his worn duffel bag through the airlock and stepped into the most incredible sight he had ever seen. The main corridor of Kepler Station stretched out before him like a crystal cathedral floating in space. Massive windows showed the stars spinning slowly as the station rotated, creating artificial gravity that felt almost like home. But it was the other students that made Jake stop and stare. A creature that looked like living crystal walked past, its body catching and reflecting the overhead lights in rainbow patterns. Behind it, something that resembled a giant mantis clicked along on 6 legs, carrying books in its 4 arms. A cloud of glowing gas drifted by at head height, somehow managing to flip through digital pages on a floating tablet. "Welcome to the big leagues," said Lisa Park, walking up beside him with her own bag. She was one of the other 3 humans in the exchange program, an engineering student from California who had scored perfect marks on every test that got her here. "It's like a zoo," whispered Carlos Rodriguez, joining them from the next airlock. His dark eyes were wide as he watched a group of blue-skinned humanoids walk by, their heads twice the size of human heads and covered in what looked like scales. "Zoo were probably the weird ones," added Emma Walsh, the 4th member of their little human group. She had been quiet during the long journey from Earth, but now she seemed just as amazed as the rest of them. They followed the flow of students through corridors that seemed to go on forever. The station was huge, big enough to hold a small city. Signs in dozens of languages pointed the way to different sections. Jake could read some of them thanks to the translation implant all exchange students received, but others were just patterns of color or sound that his human brain could not process. Their first stop was the Housing Assignment Center. A bored-looking alien with tentacles instead of arms handed them each a data pad with their room assignments. Jake found out he would be sharing space with something called a Crex, which meant nothing to him. "Room 847 Delta," he read aloud. "Anyone know what a Crex is?" "Some kind of bug person, I think," said Carlos, looking at his own assignment. "I got paired with a Vorthan. Hope it doesn't try to eat me." They split up to find their rooms. Jake's was on the 84th level, which took him 20 minutes to reach even with the high-speed lifts. The door opened to reveal a space about the size of a small apartment with 2 sleeping areas that looked very different from each other. One side had a normal bed, desk, and closet that could have come from any human college. The other side looked like someone had built a giant terrarium filled with dirt, rocks, and what might have been plants. A sweet, earthy smell filled the air. Something moved in the terrarium section. Jake stepped closer and saw what had to be his roommate. The Crex looked like a praying mantis that had decided to walk upright and grow to human size. Its compound eyes were the size of dinner plates, and its 4 arms moved independently as it arranged small objects on a shelf. "You must be Jake Morrison," the creature said in perfect English, though its voice sounded like it was coming through a synthesizer. "I am Chittick of the Crex Collective. I have been looking forward to meeting a human." "Nice to meet you, too," Jake said, trying not to stare at the way Chittick's head could rotate almost completely around. "This is a great room." "The environmental controls were challenging to configure," Chittick replied. "My species requires specific humidity and soil composition to remain healthy. I hope the scent does not bother you." "It's fine," Jake said, and meant it. The smell reminded him of the garden his grandmother had kept back in Ohio. "Actually, it's kind of nice." They spent the next hour getting to know each other, while Jake unpacked his few belongings. Chittick was fascinated by human culture, and asked dozens of questions about Earth. Jake found himself trying to explain concepts like weather, seasons, and natural disasters to someone whose home world apparently had none of those things. "Your planet sounds very dangerous," Chittick observed, his mandibles clicking in what Jake was learning meant concern. How do your people survive with such unstable conditions? We adapt, Jake said with a shrug. When things get bad, we figure out how to deal with it. The next morning brought their first classes. Jake met up with Lisa, Carlos, and Emma at the dining hall, which was an adventure in itself. The food selection included things that looked familiar, alongside dishes that might have been plants, rocks, or something else entirely. Jake stuck to what looked like bread and fruit, while Lisa adventurously tried something that glowed slightly. Their first class was mandatory safety orientation, held in a large lecture hall filled with students from dozens of species. Professor Zethkar was of Ratheri, which meant he looked like an octopus that had learned to walk upright and wear clothes. His 8 tentacles moved constantly as he spoke, manipulating displays and pointing at diagrams. Safety aboard Kepler. Station is everyone's responsibility, he began, his translated voice carrying the weight of someone who had given this speech many times. This facility operates in one of the most hostile environments known to science. The vacuum of space, radiation exposure, gravitational anomalies, and mechanical failures can kill you in seconds if proper protocols are not followed. The alien. Students around them took careful notes, their various forms of writing, implements moving frantically across data pads and note-taking devices. Jake noticed that many of them looked genuinely worried as Professor Zethkar described the ways they could die. In the event of atmospheric breach, the professor continued, you will have approximately 15 seconds to reach emergency oxygen supplies. This is not sufficient time for panic or confusion. You must know the location of every emergency station in your living and study areas. A student near the front raised what might have been a hand. Professor, what if we cannot reach an emergency station in time? Then you will likely die, Professor Zethkar replied matter-of-factly. This is why we train extensively in emergency procedures. There is no room for error in space. Jake glanced at his human friends and saw they were all wearing the same expression he probably had, a kind of mild interest mixed with confusion about why this was so complicated. When a pipe burst in your house, you turned off the water and fixed it. When a storm came, you got inside and waited for it to pass. When something broke, you figured out how to repair it or work around it. The lecture continued for 2 hours, covering everything from explosive decompression to reactor failures to asteroid impacts. Professor Zethkar demonstrated the proper way to put on emergency suits, showed them how to seal breached compartments, and explained the evacuation procedures for different types of catastrophes dotted around them. Alien students asked detailed questions about every procedure. They wanted to know the exact steps, the proper timing, the backup plans for when the backup plans failed. They treated each piece of information like their lives depended on memorizing it perfectly. The humans, meanwhile, seemed to absorb the information without much effort. When Professor Zethkar asked for volunteers to demonstrate emergency suit procedures, Jake found himself helping Chittick with his equipment while barely paying attention to his own. The suit was pretty straightforward. You put it on, sealed it up, and turned on the air. He had worn more complicated gear during winter camping trips back home. Is this correct? Chittick asked, his forearms tangled in the straps of his emergency. Dear, here, let me help, Jake said, quickly sorting out the straps and showing his roommate how to secure the helmet. It's like putting on a coat, just with more steps. Other students nearby turned to watch, surprised at how easily Jake handled equipment that was giving them trouble. A crystalline silithy student named Quartz pulsed with colors that the translation system said meant curiosity. How are you so calm about this? Quartz asked, her voice sounding like wind chimes. These procedures could mean the difference between life and death. Jake considered the question while helping another student with their oxygen regulator. I guess it's just common sense, he said finally. You learn what you need to know, and when something goes wrong, you deal with it. But what if you make a mistake? Pressed a gaseous Vorthan whose name was Mistral. What if you forget a step or do something wrong? Then you figure it out as you go, Emma said, speaking up from where she was showing a group of students how to test their suit seals. You don't stop trying just because you might mess up. The alien students exchanged looks that their translation implants couldn't quite interpret. But Jake got the feeling they found the human attitude toward mortal danger somewhat puzzling. They seemed to think that surviving required perfect execution of carefully planned procedures. The humans, on the other hand, seemed to view survival as something you just did, like breathing or walking. As the class ended and students filed out, Professor Zethkar made a note on his datapad while watching the humans pack up their gear with casual efficiency. There was something different about these four, something that made them stand out among his students. They treated potentially lethal situations like minor inconveniences and handled safety equipment like they had been born knowing how to use it. He had taught thousands of students from hundreds of species over his long career, but he had never seen anything quite like this. It would be interesting to see how they handled a 3 weeks had passed since Jake and his friends arrived at Kepler Station. They had settled into their routines, made friends with their alien roommates, and started to understand how the massive space station worked. Jake was getting good grades in his engineering classes, and Chittick had taught him how to play a Krex strategy game that involved moving colored stones around a complex board. The humans had also learned more about their classmates. The Sci-Fi, like quartz, were made of living crystal and could change colors to show their emotions. The Krex were incredibly smart, but had trouble with physical tasks that required quick reactions. The Vorthans were actually colonies of tiny gas creatures that worked together to form a single mind. Each species had evolved on worlds that were safe and predictable, where the biggest dangers were other intelligent beings, not the planets themselves. On Tuesday morning, Jake was in Advanced Engineering Lab 7 with 20 other students from different species. They were working on a project to design better fusion containment systems, the same technology that powered the station and kept them all alive in the cold vacuum of space. Professor Zethkar moved between the work groups, his tentacles adjusting equipment and answering questions. Jake was partnered with Chittick and a Sci-Fi student named Prism, who had become friends with the humans over the past few weeks. They were running calculations on plasma flow dynamics when the lights in the lab started to flicker. "That's odd," Professor Zethkar muttered, checking a display panel near his desk. The power grid shows normal operations. The lights flickered again. Longer this time? Several students looked up from their work, concern showing in whatever way their species expressed worry. Chittick's compound eyes dilated, and Prism's crystal body shifted to a nervous yellow color. Jake felt a small vibration through the floor, like the hum of heavy machinery changing pitch. It was subtle, but growing stronger. He had felt something similar once when his uncle's factory had equipment failure, right before a big generator had exploded. "Professor," Jake said, standing up from his workstation, "I think we might have a problem." Before Professor Zethkar could respond, the station's emergency system came alive. Red lights flashed in the corridors outside the lab, and the general alarm began to wail. It was a deep, penetrating sound that made everyone stop what they were doing. "Attention all personnel," came a voice over the communication system. "We are experiencing a critical malfunction in fusion reactor complex 3. All non-essential personnel must evacuate affected areas immediately." This is not a drill. The alien students froze. Even Professor Zethkar seemed stunned by the announcement. In his long career teaching at the station, he had never experienced a real emergency. The safety drills were serious business, but this was the actual thing they had been preparing for. Chittick made A high-pitched clicking sound that Jake had learned meant panic. Prism flashed through several colors quickly, settling on a deep red that probably meant terror. Other students around the lab began to make various noises of distress. Then the artificial gravity hiccuped. For a moment, everyone in the lab felt weightless as the gravity generators struggled to maintain their field. Books, tools, and loose. Equipment floated in the air for several seconds before crashing back down as the system recovered. The impact sent a student computer sliding off a table to shatter on the floor. "Emergency protocols, everyone," Professor Zethkar called out, but his voice cracked with stress. "We need to follow the evacuation procedures we practiced." But the alien students were not following procedures. They were standing frozen in place, overwhelmed by the reality of actual danger. All their careful studying and note-taking had not prepared them for the moment when the Yanga emergency was real and happening right now. The lights went out completely for 5 seconds, then came back on dimmer than before. Sparks began shooting from an overhead conduit, raining hot metal fragments down onto the lab tables. The air started to smell like burning electronics, and Ozone.Jake looked around the lab and saw that while the alien students were paralyzed with fear, his human friends were already moving. Lisa was at the main control panel, trying to shut down the lab's experiments safely before they evacuated. Carlos was helping smaller students move away from the sparking conduit. Emma was checking the emergency supply locker near the door. "We need to get out of here," Jake said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "The reactor problems are going to affect this whole section of the station." "But the evacuation procedures?" Chittick clicked frantically. "We must follow the proper steps. We must wait for official instructions." Another vibration shook the station, stronger this time. Through the lab's windows, Jake could see other parts of the station going dark as power systems failed. Emergency lighting was kicking in throughout the complex, casting everything in an eerie red glow. "The proper steps assume we have time to follow them," Jake replied, moving to help Professor Zethkar, who seemed overwhelmed by managing 20 panicked students from different species. "Right now, we need to move." Lisa looked up from the control panel. "I've shut down our experiments, but the main lab systems are not responding. We're going to lose life support in this section soon." As if to prove her point, the air circulation system made a grinding noise and stopped working. The normal background hum of air movement disappeared, leaving an unsettling quiet broken only by the distant emergency alarms. Carlos finished helping a group of small lizard-like students away from the sparking equipment. "The corridor outside is clear, but I can see smoke coming from the direction of the main lifts." Emma had the emergency supply kit open and was handing out portable oxygen units to students who looked like they might need them. "These should give us about 30 minutes of air each if we lose atmosphere completely." The alien students watched the humans work with something like amazement, while they had been standing around waiting for someone to tell them what to do. The 4 humans had assessed the situation, taken action to make it safer, and started organizing an evacuation. "How are you so calm?" Prism asked, her crystal body flashing colors that indicated confusion. "This is a life-threatening emergency. People could die." "That's exactly why we need to stay calm," Emma replied, checking the seal on Prism's emergency. "Oxygen mask. Panicking doesn't help anyone survive." Professor Zethkar was trying to contact the station's emergency coordination center, but the communication system was not working properly. Static filled the speakers, broken by occasional fragments of urgent messages from other parts of the station. "Professor," Jake said, moving to the 8-tentacled instructor's side, "we can't wait for official word. The reactor complex is 3 levels down and 2 sections over. If it goes completely, the explosion could breach the hull in this area." "How? Do you know that?" Professor Zethkar asked. "I looked at the station schematics when we first arrived," Jake replied. "Always good to know where you are and what could go wrong. Lisa nodded from where she was helping Chittick with his emergency. Gear. Basic situational awareness. You learn to pay attention to your environment when your life might depend on it. Another power fluctuation hit the station, and this time several more conduits sparked and failed. The lights dimmed further, and the temperature began to drop. As the heating system struggled with reduced power, some of the alien students began to shiver, their bodies not adapted for temperature changes. "We're leaving now," Jake announced, taking charge since Professor Zethkar seemed unable to make decisions under pressure. "Everyone stays together. If someone has trouble keeping up, we help them. No one gets left behind." Carlos opened the lab door and checked the corridor outside. "It's clear, but there's definitely smoke coming from the reactor section. We need to go the long way around to reach the evacuation pods." The group began to move out of the lab, with the humans naturally, taking positions at the front, middle, and rear of the group to help keep everyone together. Jake led the way, using his knowledge of the station layout to navigate around areas that might be dangerous. As they walked through corridors filled with emergency lighting and the smell of failing systems, the alien students began to understand that their careful safety training had not really prepared them for this moment. But somehow, the humans who had seemed so casual about emergency procedures were exactly the people you wanted with you when the emergency was real. Behind them, Engineering Lab 7 went completely dark as another power system failed. Whatever was happening to the reactor was getting worse, and they were running out of time to reach safety. The group had made it halfway to the evacuation pods when the station's main computer delivered the news that made everyone stop walking. The automated voice echoed through the corridors with mechanical calm that made the message even more terrifying. "Attention, all personnel. Reactor containment field at 30% and falling. Estimated time to complete failure is 12 minutes. All personnel must reach minimum safe distance immediately. Repeat, containment failure in 12 minutes. Professor Zethkar's tentacles went limp with shock. Around him, the alien students made sounds of despair in their various languages. Chittick's clicking became so rapid it sounded like static. Prism flashed between colors so quickly, she looked like a disco ball. Even the usually composed Vorthan students began to lose their shape as panic set in. 12 minutes, whispered a small reptilian student named Sisk. The evacuation pods are 15 minutes away at normal walking speed. And we are not walking at normal speed, added another student, this one resembling a walking tree with too many branches. Some of us cannot move quickly. Jake pulled out his datapad and called up the station schematic he had studied weeks ago. His fingers moved quickly across the screen, tracing possible routes to safety. The others watched him work, and he could feel their hope depending on what he found. "There's a problem," he said after a moment. "The main route to the evacuation pods goes through Section C7. That's right next to the reactor complex. If we go that way and the containment fails while we're there, we'll be dead instantly." "What about the other routes?" Lisa asked, looking over his shoulder at the display. "The long way around takes us through the outer ring," Jake replied, pointing to a path that curved along the station's edge. "It would take 20 minutes minimum, and that's if nothing else goes wrong." "So we're trapped," Professor Zethkar said, his voice hollow with defeat. "There is no way to reach safety in time." Carlos was studying the schematic from another angle. "What about the maintenance corridors?" "They run through the inner structure. Those are not designed for foot traffic," Professor Zethkar replied. "They pass through areas with no atmosphere, high radiation, and extreme temperatures. No one could survive that passage. No one from your species could survive it," Emma said quietly. "But we're not from your species." Jake was already thinking the same thing. He zoomed in on the maintenance route that cut straight through the station's core. It was a direct line to the evacuation pods, passing through spaces that were never meant for living beings. The route would take them through vacuum-exposed corridors, past active power conduits throwing off deadly radiation, and through sections where the temperature ranged from freezing to hot enough to melt most metals. It's suicide, Chittick clicked frantically. The pressure differential alone would kill us. Our bodies would explode in the vacuum. Your bodies would, Jake said, still studying the route. But humans evolved on a planet where the environment tried to kill us every single day for millions of years. We're built differently. Lisa was looking at the same data, running calculations in her head. We'd need to improvise pressure suits from lab equipment, jury-rigged life support systems, create heat shields from whatever materials we can find. Even if that were possible, said Mistral, the Vorthan student, who was barely holding his gaseous form together, how would that help us? We cannot survive what you can survive. You don't have to, Emma said, moving to the emergency supply lockers that lined the corridor. We carry you. The alien students stared at her like she had suggested they all grow wings and fly to safety. Professor Zethkar's tentacles writhed in what Jake had learned was extreme agitation. Carry us through vacuum and radiation? Prism flashed colors that probably meant she thought the humans had lost their minds. That is impossible. You would die, and we would die, and everyone would be dead. Maybe, Jake admitted, pulling equipment from the supply lockers and examining it with the eye of someone who had spent his childhood figuring out how to fix broken things with whatever was handy. But definitely is worse than maybe. Carlos was already stripping insulation from power cables, his hands working with the confidence of someone who had helped his father repair farm equipment, since he was old enough to hold tools. We can make sealed containers from the specimen storage units. They're designed to hold biological samples in controlled environments. The emergency oxygen canisters have enough air for 30 minutes each, Lisa added, checking the supplies. If we can modify the flow regulators, we can stretch that to 45 minutes for the smaller students. Emma was examining the portable heating units used for scientific experiments. These can be rigged as heat sources. If we wrap them in reflective material, they'll keep the containers warm enough to prevent freezing. Jake found what he was looking for in a maintenance panel. Magnetic grapples for moving heavy equipment. We can use these to pull ourselves along the metal surfaces when there's no gravity. The alien students watched in amazement as the humans transformed random pieces of equipment into what looked like a survival plan. Things that had seemed like impossible obstacles to them were becoming problems with solutions in the hands of people who approached danger as something to be managed rather than feared. This is insane, Professor Zethkar said, but he was no longer sounding defeated. Even if your plan works, the radiation exposure alone would be lethal. Not immediately. Lethal, Jake corrected, testing the seal on a makeshift pressure suit he was building from a specimen container and emergency foam. We can take a lot more radiation than most species before it kills us. Earth's magnetic field isn't as strong as most worlds, so we evolved with higher tolerance. What about the cold? Asked Sisk, the small reptilian student. The maintenance. Corridors dropped to near absolute zero. Mammals are warm-blooded, Carlos explained while rigging a life support system from spare parts. Our bodies generate heat internally. Cold that would kill you instantly just makes us uncomfortable. And the vacuum exposure? Chittick clicked, though his panic was being replaced by something that might have been hope. Humans can survive in vacuum for about 90 seconds before permanent damage, Emma said, testing the seal on another improvised container. Long enough to get from one safe section to another if we move fast. Lisa looked up from the modified oxygen system she was building. The route Jake found has pressurized sections every few hundred meters. Emergency maintenance stations. We can rest and recharge there. It's not a great plan, Jake admitted, putting the finishing touches on what would serve as Chiddix's survival pod. But it's the only plan that gets everyone out alive. Another vibration shook the station, stronger than before. Through the corridor windows, they could see entire sections of the outer ring going dark as power systems continued to fail. Emergency. Lighting was failing too, leaving whole areas in the red glow of backup systems. Containment field at 20%, announced the computer voice. Estimated time to failure is 8 minutes. Professor Zethkar looked at his students, then at the humans who were calmly preparing to do something that should have been impossible. In all his years of teaching safety procedures, he had never imagined a situation where the safest course of action was to intentionally expose yourself to every deadly hazard space could offer. How do we know this will work? He asked. Jake tested the magnetic grapples one more time and shouldered the improvised pack that would carry their supplies. We don't, he said simply. But staying here definitely won't work. Sometimes you have to choose between definitely dying and probably dying. Emma finished sealing Prism into her makeshift survival container, making sure the crystal student had enough room to maintain her structure. On Earth, we have a saying, when you're going through hell, keep going. What does that mean? Mistral asked, his gaseous form now contained in a modified atmospheric processor. It means you don't stop moving just because things are bad, Carlos replied, lifting the container that held 2 of the smaller students. You keep going until you reach the other side. Jake checked his makeshift radiation detector, built from a scientific instrument and some spare electronics. Time to go. Everyone ready? The alien students, sealed in their improvised survival pods and carried by humans who treated walking through lethal space hazards like a challenging hike, could only trust that these strange beings from the death world called Earth actually knew what they were doing. Containment field at 15%, the computer announced. Estimated time to failure is 6 minutes. Jake opened the maintenance access hatch that led into the most dangerous part of the station. Cold air rushed out, carrying the smell of ozone and metal. Beyond the hatch lay a corridor with no atmosphere, no heat, and enough radiation to kill most life forms in minutes. Remember, he said to his friends, we've been training for this our whole lives. We just didn't know it. Then he stepped into the vacuum, and the real test began. Jake stepped into the maintenance corridor and felt the cold hit him like a physical blow. The temperature was well below freezing, cold enough to kill most of the alien species instantly. But humans had evolved through ice ages, and Jake's body immediately began adjusting. His breathing became shallow and controlled, his muscles tensed to generate more heat, and his blood flow shifted to protect his vital organs. The corridor stretched ahead, in absolute darkness, except for the light. From Jake's improvised helmet lamp, there was no air, no sound except what conducted through the metal surfaces, and no gravity to speak of. Jake activated the magnetic grapples and began pulling himself forward along the metal wall, moving hand over hand like he was climbing a ladder that happened to be horizontal. Behind him came Lisa, carrying the container that held Prism and another small student. Even in the bulky makeshift pressure suit, she moved with confidence, her engineering training helping her understand how the station's structure worked. She had grown up in California, but she had spent summers with relatives in Alaska, learning to survive in conditions that would challenge anyone. Carlos followed with the largest group of students, 3 containers magnetic clamped to a makeshift sled he was pulling. The extra weight that would have been impossible for most species was just heavy lifting for someone whose ancestors had carried tools and supplies across continents on foot. His breath fogged inside his helmet as he worked, but his movements were steady and sure. Emma brought up the rear, carrying Professor Zethkar in a container built from the largest specimen storage unit they could find. The 8-tentacled professor was cramped inside, but alive and breathing recycled air that would last another 30 minutes if everything went right. Jake's radiation detector, strapped to his wrist, began clicking faster as they moved deeper into the station's core. The levels were already high enough to cause radiation sickness in most species, but humans had evolved with higher tolerance for cellular damage. They could take exposure that would kill others and still function long enough to reach safety. First stretch of corridor was 200 meters long, ending at an emergency maintenance station that should have pressurized atmosphere and working life support. Jake could see the airlock door ahead, marked with warning symbols in a dozen languages. All of them basically said the same thing. Authorized personnel only. Extreme danger. Protective equipment required. They were definitely not authorized. The danger was definitely extreme, and their protective equipment was built from spare parts and held together with emergency foam. But they were still moving forward because the alternative was sitting still and dying. Jake reached the airlock and began the process of getting everyone inside. The chamber was small, designed for 1 or 2 maintenance workers, not 4 humans and 20 alien students in improvised survival containers. But they made it work by stacking the containers and squeezing together in a way that would have been impossible for most species. The airlock pressurized with a hiss of recycled air that tasted like metal and cleaning chemicals. Jake helped the others out of their makeshift suits, checking everyone for signs of radiation exposure or cold damage. The humans were fine, just slightly out of breath from the exertion. The alien students in their containers were scared but unharmed. Containment field at 10%, came the computer voice through the maintenance station's speakers. Estimated. Time to failure is 3 minutes. We're halfway there, Jake announced, checking his map of the station layout. 1 more corridor section, and we reach the evacuation pod bay. The next section is worse, Lisa warned, looking at the technical readouts for the corridor ahead. Higher radiation, lower temperature, and a section where we'll be exposed to hard vacuum for almost 5 minutes straight. Chittick clicked nervously from inside his container. 5 minutes in vacuum will kill you. Your training said 90 seconds maximum. That's for unprotected exposure, Emma replied, checking the seals on the containers. We have our suits, and we can hold our breath longer when we need to. How much longer? Professor Zethkar asked from his cramped container. Let's find out, Jake said, beginning to put his improvised pressure suit back on. The second corridor was everything Lisa had warned about and worse. The moment they left the maintenance station, Jake felt the radiation hit him like invisible fire. His detector was clicking so fast it sounded like static. The cold was beyond anything he had experienced. Cold enough to freeze exposed skin in seconds, but he kept moving forward because that was what humans did. When the environment tried to kill them, they adapted and kept going. When the challenges seemed impossible, they found ways to make them possible. When death was certain by staying still, they chose uncertain death by moving forward. The vacuum section was the worst part. Jake had to disconnect his air supply and hold his breath while pulling himself through a gap where the station's hull had been damaged by micrometeorites. For 5 long minutes, he was exposed to the hard radiation and absolute cold of space itself, with nothing between him and death except his makeshift suit and his determination to get his friends to safety. His lungs burned as he held his breath, pulling himself hand over hand through the gap. Behind him, the others followed, each human taking their turn in the vacuum, while protecting the alien students who could never have survived this crossing. Carlos's face was blue with cold by the time he made it through, but he was still moving. Lisa's radiation detector was clicking like an angry insect, but she was still conscious. Emma's suit had a small tear that was sealed with emergency foam, but she was still breathing. When they finally reached the last maintenance station, Jake's hands were shaking from cold and radiation exposure. His vision was starting to blur around the edges, and he could taste blood in his mouth. But they were alive, and they were almost to safety. Containment field at 5%, announced the computer. Estimated time to failure is 90 seconds. The final stretch was just 50 meters of normal corridor to the evacuation pod bay. Jake could see the lights of the bay through the airlock window, and beyond that, the escape pods that would carry them away from the station before the reactor exploded. But 50 meters might as well have been 50 kilometers if they couldn't. Cover the distance in 90 seconds. Jake looked at his friends, all of them exhausted and radiation sick, all of them pushed to the limits of what even humans could endure. But they were still standing, still thinking, still problem-solving, even when their bodies were starting to fail. "We run," he said simply. "All of us, as fast as we can, carrying everyone. 90 seconds to cover 50 meters and get into the pods." "The containers are too heavy to run with," Carlos pointed out, his voice hoarse from breathing recycled air and fighting off hypothermia. "Then we don't run with the containers," Lisa said, her engineering mind already working on the problem. "We open them here, carry the students directly, and run like our lives depend on it." "Because they do," Emma added, helping Professor Zethkar out of his cramped container. Jake opened the airlock to the final corridor and felt normal air pressure and temperature for the first time in what felt like hours. The corridor was well lit and warm with the familiar hum of working life support systems. 60 seconds, announced the computer. They ran. Jake scooped up 3 of the smaller alien students, his human endurance allowing him to carry weight that would have crushed other species. Lisa carried Prism in her arms like a crystal sculpture, moving with the determination of someone who had spent her life solving problems under pressure. Carlos lifted Professor Zethkar, all 8 tentacles and considerable alien bulk, and still managed to keep pace with the others. Emma gathered the remaining students and pushed forward, her breath coming in short gasps, but her steps never slowing. Behind them, the maintenance corridors they had just survived were already being sealed by emergency systems as the station prepared for reactor failure. Ahead of them, the evacuation pod bay was a beacon of safety in a station that was minutes away from becoming a radioactive debris field. 30 seconds, called the computer voice. They reached the pod bay with 15 seconds to spare, tumbling through the airlock, concealing it behind them, just as the evacuation pods began their automatic launch sequence. Jake felt the acceleration as their pod shot away from the station, carrying them to safety just as the reactor containment field finally collapsed. Through the pod's small window, they watched Kepler Station disappear in a flash of light that briefly outshone the nearby star. Where the massive educational facility had been, there was now only expanding plasma and debris, but they were alive. All of them. The humans who had treated impossible survival as a problem to be solved, and the alien students who had learned that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is trust beings who evolved on a world that tried to kill them every day. In the safety of the evacuation pod, racing toward the rescue ships that were already on their way, the alien students began to understand something that would change how the galaxy thought about humans forever. The rescue ship Harmony arrived 6 hours after the explosion of Kepler Station. By then, the evacuation pods had been drifting in space long enough for everyone to catch their breath and start processing what had just happened. The ship's medical bay was soon filled with alien students receiving treatment for shock and minor injuries, while the 4 humans sat in a corner, quietly exhausted but essentially unharmed. Dr. Velith, the ship's chief medical officer, was a tall, graceful being from the Zenari species who had seen many different kinds of injuries in her long career. But she had never seen anything quite like the radiation exposure readings from the humans. According to her instruments, they should have been dead or at least critically ill from the levels of hard radiation they had absorbed. Instead, they were tired and slightly nauseous, like someone who had eaten too much at dinner. Your cellular repair mechanisms are remarkable, Dr. Veleth told Jake as she ran another scan. Most species would require weeks of intensive treatment after exposure like this. Your bodies are already beginning to heal the damage. We're pretty tough, Jake replied with a shrug that made several of his alien classmates exchange meaningful looks. Even now, after everything they had witnessed, the humans still treated their extraordinary survival abilities as nothing special. Of what had happened spread quickly through the galactic communication networks. The security footage from Kepler Station, recovered from backup systems before the explosion, showed everything. 4 young humans calmly organizing an evacuation, while experienced professors and older students panicked. The same humans building survival equipment from spare parts and walking through conditions that should have killed them instantly. The footage of Jake stepping into hard vacuum without hesitation, of Lisa carrying alien students through radiation. That would have been lethal to her own species. Of Carlos and Emma treating a civilization-ending disaster like a particularly challenging homework assignment, became the most watched recordings in galactic history. Within days, representatives from dozens of worlds were asking the same questions. How had humans become so naturally adapted to survival? What kind of planet created beings who could walk through vacuum and radiation like it was a minor inconvenience? And most importantly, what did this mean for the rest of the galaxy? Professor Zethkar, recovering in the ship's medical bay from his own ordeal, found himself surrounded by colleagues and reporters who wanted to understand what they had witnessed. The old Vrothery had taught safety procedures for over 2 centuries, but he was beginning to realize that everything he thought he knew about emergency response had been turned upside down. They never panicked, he told a gathering of education officials who had come to investigate the incident. Not once, during the entire crisis, did any of the humans show signs of fear or confusion. They simply assessed the situation and began solving problems. But surely they must have been trained for such emergencies, suggested Dean Koreth, an administrator from the prestigious Centauri Institute. Some kind of specialized military or survival education. No, Professor Zethkar replied, his tentacles moving in patterns that indicated deep thought. I checked their records. Jake Morrison grew up on a farm in Ohio. Lisa Park was a normal engineering student from California. Carlos Rodriguez worked in his family's agricultural business. Emma Walsh was studying literature before she applied for the exchange program. None of them had any special training. And how do you explain what happened? Dean Koreth pressed. Chittick, who had been listening from his recovery bed nearby, clicked softly to get their attention. May I tell you what Jake told me about his planet? The officials gathered around the young Krek student, eager to hear anything that might explain the human's extraordinary behavior. He said Earth was dangerous, Chittick began, his mandibles clicking as he remembered the conversation. Not dangerous like a war or a criminal, but dangerous like the planet itself wanted to kill everything that lived on it. He talked about things called ice ages, where the entire world would freeze for thousands of years. Volcanoes that could destroy whole continents. Storms that could level cities. Diseases that could kill millions. Many planets have natural disasters, Dean Koreth pointed out. Not like Earth, Prism added, her crystal body pulsing with colors that indicated she was remembering something important. Lisa showed me pictures of her home. The weather changes every day. Sometimes it's hot, sometimes cold. Sometimes there are storms with lightning that can kill you instantly. She said people just check the forecast and plan around it. Emma told me about something called winter, said Sisk, the small reptilian student. For months every year, her entire continent becomes too cold for most life to survive. But humans just put on extra clothing and keep going to work and school like nothing is wrong. Dr. Velith, who had been quietly listening while reviewing the humans' medical data, spoke up. I have been analyzing their biological adaptations. Their cardiovascular systems are designed for extreme stress. Their immune systems can fight off infections that would kill most species. Their brain chemistry includes natural compounds that help them stay calm and think clearly during life-threatening situations. You're saying they evolved specifically to survive disasters? Dean Korath asked. I'm saying they evolved on a planet where surviving disasters was the only way to have children who could survive disasters, Dr. Velith replied. For millions of years, Earth killed everyone who wasn't tough enough, smart enough, or adaptable enough to handle whatever crisis came next. Professor Zethkar suddenly understood something that made his tentacles go still with the realization. That's why they don't need safety lessons. They've been taking the advanced course their entire evolutionary history. The implications were staggering. Most species in the galaxy had evolved on worlds that were relatively stable and safe. They had developed technology and civilization precisely because they didn't need to spend all their time and energy just staying alive. But humans had developed technology and civilization while their planet was actively trying to kill them. What does this mean for galactic society? Asked Dean Korith. The question hung in the air as everyone considered the possibilities. A species that treated reactor explosions as minor problems. Beings who could walk through vacuum and radiation like other people walked through rain. People who automatically organized and led during emergencies, not because they were trained to do so, but because that's how their minds naturally worked when things went wrong. Jake, who had been quietly listening from his recovery bed, finally spoke up. It means you might want to update your safety training. How so? Professor Zethkar asked. Well, Jake said, thinking about how to explain something that seemed obvious to him. All your safety procedures assume that people will panic when things go bad. But panic just makes everything worse. Instead of teaching people to follow specific steps, maybe teach them to stay calm and think about solutions. Lisa nodded from her nearby bed. And instead of trying to avoid all risks, teach people how to manage risks. Everything is dangerous if you don't know how to handle it safely. Carlos added, On Earth, we have a saying, hope for the best, but prepare for the worst. Your safety training seems to assume the best will always happen. Emma concluded, maybe the secret isn't avoiding danger. Maybe it's learning to be dangerous. Back, the alien officials and educators looked at each other, beginning to understand that they weren't just dealing with another species joining galactic civilization. They were dealing with beings who had been forged by a world so hostile that surviving it had made them into something the galaxy had never seen before. In the days that followed, as news of the Kepler Station incident spread throughout known space, other worlds began to ask a new question. If humans could handle a reactor explosion with improvised equipment and calm determination, what would they do when faced with a real crisis? The galaxy, it seemed, was about to find out why evolution on a death world creates the kind of people that other species call when the impossible needs to become routine. And why sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is give safety lessons to someone who has been surviving the unsurvivable since before their species learned to make fire. The age of human involvement in galactic affairs had officially begun, and nothing would ever be quite the same again.